Recently, I saw a stream from someone, Andrew Clark in this case, covering organized chaos, or Bob if you want to be formal about his name, responding to a leftist name, Kavanaugers, or however you say this name here. Or as I like to call him, Brother of Kavos, because that's who made me aware of this leftist existence. Whole nother story there. Now, why some people would actually call Bob a leftist, I would not, because he seems to have a very simple and dumbed down view of leftism and progressivism, however you want to define his particular slant on politics. Now, I did do a play-by-play response to this video, but it was really devoid of actual points and a little hard to follow.
Absolutely ridiculous. You have to watch Loki to understand what happens in the new Ant-Man film. On that note, we're going to be talking about Ant-Man because it's a perfect example of just how much Marvel are just really not taking into account any equality anymore, because it's clearly one of the worst reviewed Marvel films in ages. But it's also a good case study to highlight.
I mean, did you watch it? Can you give your actual critique on it? Because it doesn't sound like you can. It sounds like you're saying Rotten Tomatoes gave it a negative score, therefore it's bad. That's very surface level, man. Like,
it's funny. The Leftoid is more high-brained than the leftist with Marx's theory behind him. And after some thought, I knew that wouldn't make a very good video. So instead of doing that, there are at least 3 points I want to pull from the video that were being discussed in it that I want to discuss. The first one being the decline of Disney. Brother of Kavos sort of thinks it's capitalism's fault. Bob disagrees. But as for the decline of Disney, that's not really something limited just to them. It seems to be sort of a quality of filmmaking in these companies, Hollywood in particular, that seems to be declining across the board. Take Amazon, for instance. I mean, there's still some movies that really break the mold, but overall, it does seem to be in a decline, at least from my understanding and many other people's understanding of the medium. But that's to be expected. Yes, you will get a rare exception, but sometimes it comes out of unexpected places like foreign films and indie films. I think this primarily comes from sort of two areas. One of those seems to be Hollywood and the general industry sort of disdain or dislike of writers that's been sort of increasing over the last 20 years. There was a writer's strike in 2007, and even some talk of them doing it again. It's a minor point that I will be bringing up later, but it does play a factor in my overall assessment of the decline of writing in film. As for Disney in particular, they are really suffering from the march on progress, plus some really bad decisions, managerial-wise, in my opinion. But let me not jump into that rabbit hole in this video. Something I believe is really underestimated in our current discussions is media theory, weighing in effect on the state of discourse in recent years, at least from what I've seen. But in it, there is a life cycle to any given media technology. You probably know that song. As cringy as it is, it seems to hold a certain amount of truth to it. Just like phones killed the telegraph and cell phones killed the pager. Don't know what a pager is, then that would sort of be proving that point. That sort of was a short-lived thing whenever. I don't want to ramble on for too long, so let me get to the point. The point is, much like media technologies, genre has a life cycle. At least that's a personal belief of mine. And both of them can be applied to Disney. On the technology side of things, movies and movie theaters have been in decline since the introduction of streaming and digital downloads. And the global pandemic has just sort of sped up that process. That means more money and brain power from Disney, as well as a lot of other companies, have to be put into building up their streaming platforms, and really less into the movie departments. At least that's the theory I'm working with. Now, I'm not sure if this is sort of an indicator of the last stage of the technology tree or the genre, but things getting bought up, taken by a whole bunch of companies sort of coming together, all these IPs such as Marvel and Star Wars coming together under one umbrella is one of the signs of this sort of later stages of media development before it dies or has a resurgence. Plus, with the money and probably the management they had to spend on managing these IPs, it really probably kept a strain to the sort of spreading out Disney was trying to do with their mass popularity of these massive popular franchises that they bought the rights to. Now, I don't even want to get into those details about mismanagement or crap like that, since there's enough opinions and theories about all that fun stuff clogging up the YouTube search algorithm already. Now, this is a personal theory about the rise and decline of media adapted to genres. In this particular case, the genre superhero movies, which is the most relevant to the topics expressed in the video that I'm technically trying to respond to. Now, you could say the same about the Star Wars IP, but it's not something I'll be concerned with, at least for this sort of response discussion thing. As with technology, I believe genres have similar cycles to them. So you start making them popular, making good movies off of the actual comic books, which sort of is going through its own sort of life cycle. So you have the popularization of people flocking into superhero movies, probably thanks to the earlier success of the Avengers and Avengers cast movies, which they do discuss Iron Man's quality comparison to how it seems to have been in decline since a certain point. I'll agree. Iron Man 1 was one of those movies that pushed superhero genres into the popular mainstream range of acceptability. Same thing with the original Avengers movie. I don't know how Age of Ultron and Captain America Civil War didn't hurt it somewhat, but I can understand how they were designed to sort of get into the general mass appeal, along with a ton of other movies that tied in rather well. So you have that rise in popularity, and movie companies decide to put more money into making the films, promoting the films, marketing them, discussions, profit, success for the movie studio, and their reputation. At this sort of apex, you have the mass appeal among the general populace. It's all the buzz, all the rage, all that fun stuff that people talk about. But you can only ride that high for so long before it comes crashing down. Now, the final stage of both technology is sort of the niche marketing. Now, the final stage of both the technology and I believe to be genre is the niche marketing, meaning that you need to start tailoring these pieces of media towards certain target audiences, different demographics, some such like that. This is what I believe I see what's happening in the Marvel IP after the apex of the Marvel movies, such as Infinity War and Endgame. Now, sometimes this niche marketing, like for radio, they had satellite radio that gave radio a sudden resurgence for people, probably thanks to Howard Stern. Now, niche marketing can just sort of plateau and cater to a certain audience, or in Disney cases, multiple different target audiences, which I think is a mistake on their part. It can go almost into hibernation, like some of those silly trends like bell bottoms and other retro crap like that. Not saying retro is bad, it'll always have a deep place in my heart, or it can have a resurgent. With my example with satellite radio, there's plenty of other things that sort of gets it back into mass popularity, although satellite radio I don't think really brought it up, with the exception of some things like Howard Stern for a little bit there. So, unless Disney can find a new way to bring superhero content to a more general audience on their streaming platform, maybe focus on a few movies that make full use of the theater, that is sort of where Marvel's gonna stay, in this sort of end state, which is why I find it funny they say late stage capitalism. It's more late stage media theory, in my opinion, that is sort of causing this perceived decline in the medium. But that's the natural life cycle of these sort of things. Now, for this particular case, they're discussing the Ant-Man movie in this context, which I think might be a misstep. Because personally, from the marketing and what I've seen about Ant-Man, it actually does well to fall into that niche marketing, although I'm not quite sure if a theatrical release was worthwhile considering what people are saying about it. But it's fun for the kids, and I think that's the tactic they wanted to go with, sort of considering the comparisons with the Shark Boy and Lava Girl thing. Just a theory of mine. I also think they might actually be starting to see this, and they might have actually reworked sort of the script and movie generally to sort of appeal to this younger audience. They're easier to please audience who would rather have silly little things and don't care as much about good writing as most people's. But I would love to see like a kid critic. It stinks. John Lovett's gotta love him. A better movie example for the sort of movie designed to have sort of more mass appeal to the general public to keep up the MCU's presence in the public would be something like Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. And now I would love to go into that and how it's succeeded or failed, but I'm getting enough off topic as it is. The second thing that's got brought up in this video is artistic freedom in filmmaking. America versus Russia. Now, Bob, even with his limited understanding, just authoritarianism bad, I think it's a lot more complex than that, but I do agree with his general sentiment. Now let's go with the idea Kovno Brain thinks that Russia gives their artists more artistic freedom than the movie makers in Hollywood enjoy. Sorry, can't help with the laugh there. As I said, it seems like Bob is at least smart enough to pick up on the biggest catch with that they aren't allowed to criticize the government. What Cover's simp dictator is leaving out here is that Russia, along with China, are making it really hard to do progressive messaging in any media that they approve of because it is political, clearly to a very high degree. So that sort of seems to be a conflict with anyone who's leftist in this country, but that man's been in Vietnam and almost seems proud about it, which, okay, la la tanky land for him. Now sure, Russia and countries like that don't care as much about making money as, the dirty capitalists do. But what they do care about is reinforcing the social values of the motherland. Or what other nation state that their authoritarian brains are picking out. So it really doesn't matter how much money it makes. I mean, I'm sure it's helpful to them if it does. It's an indication of popularity and spreading the idea. But it is really more about not disrupting the conditioning that these sort of countries have, which are getting more authoritarian in nature to sort of uphold their control over the populace. And why Russia is probably one of these countries that are the most loose with their control over the media. Not saying that they are anyway good, but comparison to China and North Korea, they're downright sensible. Plus, I think they have a strong faith in their ability to manipulate technology, other words, propaganda, because they have a long history and pride, Russian pride, in using film as a propaganda tool to sort of get the masses to go along with them. It's sort of failing to a certain degree. Information age, there's only so long that you can control that. let me not even get into the war topics. Whole nother bag. And as I said, this country has a proud history of both film and theater within it that they want to spread to the world in sort of post-communistic fashion. Sorry, I would have to go way too far into the dirt and do a lot more research to get into that topic. But I believe it's a solid principle to at least end this on. Now, they definitely probably don't care what methods their film creators use to tell a story or how much money it makes, as long as it really doesn't disturb the status quo in the ones that are in charge of the nation and, ideally promote the values of that culture, which definitely seems to be a little homophobic and probably transphobic, so Bob definitely couldn't get behind it. I don't know how the other dude, Brother Cavos, can, but that's something I don't even want to try to dissect. But of course, Russia tries to sort of hide its power level, so to speak, and how it promotes its message to not come off too bad in the world. I'm sure that's going to change given the nature of the world right now, but that's besides the point. Now we come to the third thing, the idea that unionization would solve the VFX problem, or everything in general. It's the underlying general principle about what Bob and Cavo Dumbass sort of agrees on. So this third point about unionization is really sort of funny to me, given the effects of the writer's strike in Hollywood. I really don't have all the details on that, but from my general sentiment, reality TV really shifted the model, and Hollywood seems to be just not very respectful of writers or even really directors of high quality unless they have brand recognition to them or some sort of nostalgia factor willing to play up that member berry bait. They probably don't think very highly of the general population and what they can get them to enjoy. Back to the union point, much of the same would actually probably even happen if the VFX artists did try to unionize. Now, the idea that just the VXF artists unionizing to sort of get rights and push back is, as I said, comical to me. Look at what it did for the writers. And why I have not done too much particular research on this particular matter, which I will admit to, I am sure that this is something the executives of the studios actively discourage, given the fact that it really hasn't happened yet, despite all the other freaking sectors of workers in Hollywood having these sort of unions established for like directors, actors, hell, even editors have their own freaking union. Personally, I don't understand why the VXF artists don't really fall under the editors union. Now, why I really don't want to get into sort of my thoughts on the pitfalls of sort of the unionization process that I personally believe there to be out there. Let's go with a union that most leftists and leftoids and even progressives and even some mainstream Democrats sort of can get behind with the problems with the police unions. You want to know why the police has so many protections and why it's so hard to fire and convict people of crimes in the police? Well, I'm not going to say it's just the fault of the police unions, but I am sure they played a big role in many of the rules that were set up in the law to protect police officers and, other elements of law enforcement that people similar to Bob and Cavernosa nuts complain about on the regular. Probably more the former than the latter, but... So aside from the union issue, there's a matter of supply and demand. Foreign concept to leftists generally, but let me try to explain this as well as I can. Much like the video game boom of the 90s really had children wanting to grow up to sort of work into the related fields. Now, why I do not know if this is the case, I do know it's the case of a lot of people going into these programming jobs and not finding work. This is why you have a lot of people going in indies, high level of competition. I would guess, at least from my understanding of it, that VXF artists would have sort of the same flood of bright eye and bushy tailed VXF artists trying to make it into Hollywood through this method. Hell, you don't even need formal education for this job, according to certain things, at least from what limited I read. Not sure of that. I'm sure it helps, along with experience. Now, I could be wrong on that front, but given the overall dissatisfaction and poor job level of satisfaction, it seems very similar to that of the people in the games industry working on the ground for these execs. Seems to be very similar problems in both these fields, and I can't help but thinking that there's some overlap within that, because working with computers to create cool things. Now, I'm not saying this is the only reason, mismanagement of Disney and some of these other companies, I'm sure, factors into this. But despite any of those other reasons, and despite what certain people think, you don't really need an official union to take collective action among a group of professionals. It takes some guts, a leadership, but you don't need anything formally in law. As far as I know, there could be some laws that I don't know about, but you can still use collective action. Hell, that's how the harassment at Blizzard got blown out of the water. Social media is a powerful tool that really could be utilized to help out a lot of people in a lot of industries. And even if I don't like everyone who speaks out on this subject, James definitely Sterling, I do think it's something worth talking about. But still, both these guys treat unions like they are a magic bullet that's the only solution to this very complex problem, when in the reality of the situation, it's really often not that simple. Now, there are also a lot of other mini problems with this whole video, the response style with Bob, and with, of course, Kavanaugh goes. But since he was the one to expose me to, this interesting particular video, that sort of piqued my interest into see the Leftist versus the Leftoid. And also, he's been looking into the pattern of behavior of Bob, as well as some of the other fandom initiative people, as well as a lot more good faith, because I get a little bit opinionated, a little bit more spicy with what I say, probably due to my cynical and jaded nature. Let's see what insights and other thoughts from Andrew Clark about this very unique interaction between these two that I might have missed. And maybe even where he thinks I might have misread what these guys are talking about, because it is sometimes hard to tell what's the thought process that goes into some of Organized Chaos videos are. So take it away, Andrew Clark.
Thanks, Vincent. To keep things short and concise, I'll focus on the same 3 points brought up before: the decline of Disney, more specifically the MCU, artistic freedom, and lastly, how unions will solve the VFX problems. I would attribute the decline of the MCU mostly to its approach on scheduling, lack of clear vision, and reliance on CGI. They rush the scheduling, keep changing their minds, and then push all of this onto the VFX houses because what we see on screen is mostly CGI. So the VFX houses end up with a mountain of work, not much time to do it, so we get this low quality product at the end of all of that. As far as the artistic freedom goes, I think Bob actually made a good point. Essentially, what good is artistic freedom when someone is telling you what you can and can't say, when you can't criticize the government? Now, about the unions. To think that unions will solve the art issue is ridiculous. There is a triangle to represent this: time, cost, and quality. You can get a high quality product from either spending a long time on it, or requiring a high cost. In the case of CGI, this works because you have multiple servers rendering images, so more cost is like renting more servers, or to render those images. So unionizing would be unlikely to change the funding input or the expected delivery date from Disney. Only that the same quality product could cost more or take more time. Thus, while unions would improve the quality of life for the artist, it's more likely to lower the quality of the movies. And as a side note, I would liken these unions more closely with teacher unions, where cost is going up and up, quality is not necessarily improving, and it's difficult to fire problematic employees. Now back to you, Vincent.
Thank you, Andrew, for a more clear-cut, simple explanation that is probably actually a lot more helpful than all the sort of nitty-gritty that I get into. I tend to sometimes go off on wild tangents in theory, so having you in this video is very helpful for those who might be lost on what I was trying to explain earlier. Also, Andrew is on point about the most likely outcome of the unionization of the VFX artist. His side note is definitely worth considering because I believe it's a more apt example of what would most likely happen if the VXF artist unionized. The sort of police union comparison sort of falls flat because I'm pretty sure many FX artists don't have to deal with half the shit or the dangers that any cops do, unless they're working in a rather troubling area, but that's besides the point. That's more about location. I highlighted that particular union to try to sort of relate to any left-wingers who might be watching this video to sort of get the points across that I wanted to get across. By no means do I want to minimize the efforts that the police go through. Saying teaching unions may have adverse effects on the educational system thanks to the drawbacks of the unionization process is generally correct, but it's probably harsh on the left to actually acknowledge a truth like that, even though it's not always the case that that's the case. After all, both of these professions have to deal with, for the most part, uninformed, immature-minded individuals who think they know how the world should work and sort of reject having to learn the harsh realities that are actually present in the world. High school student, executives. Not much of a difference besides one has power over you and the other one can just get you in a lot of trouble if you do something stupid. With that said, I'm done.